Thanks for joining us for another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Our monthly panel is back, and there's lots to talk about when it comes to the future of the Canadian economy. With the G20 summit in Rome and now the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow, it's definitely time to check in with Joe Oliver, former finance minister and natural resources minister in the Harper government. And we also have Gary Marr, who's a former Alberta Cabinet Minister. And as I recall, he was included in that, would be a former environment minister. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Maybe start with you, Joe, if you don't mind. And before we get to the COP26 conference, which will occupy most of the program, there is also a little bit of news on the inflation front. The inflation rate has climbed to 5% in this country. So maybe give us your reaction to that, Joe. What does that all mean for Canadians and for the government?
Well, look, this is something that we heard from the central bankers in Canada. You know, the head of the Bank of Canada and the head of the Fed in the United States would not likely endure. It's transitory, which is a fancy word for temporary. Well, I think there's a real concern that it's going to be more enduring, and in the meantime, it's having a real, severe impact on the cost of living for a lot of people. And the number 5% doesn't really reflect in full the inflationary impact of a lot of things that people have to cope with, like purchases of homes and purchasing gas at the pump, where the inflation numbers are much higher indeed. So it is a concern, and what it's doing is causing the central bankers to taper their purchases of bonds, and for them to signal that perhaps interest rates will start to move up a little more quickly than they anticipated sometime next year. And of course, if they miscalculate on when to increase and how much to increase interest rates, and in the States, we're talking about moving from almost zero to a number like a 1.75%. Well, that can really have a devastating impact on the stock market and on the economy. I'm not predicting that, but it's a dangerous sort of situation, because they have to balance just when they move with their concern about keeping inflation at 2% or a range of 1% to 3%, and they indicated they were going to be fairly lax about it going to the upper end of the range, but it's well beyond that now. So people are feeling it. It's having some political implications. I mean, I think it may have had an effect on the Virginia gubernatorial race, although that wasn't the top subject. But it's impacting people in terms of their standard of living, and it poses some risks for the economy, particularly given our very high debt situation.
Gary Marr, are we into the era of inflation here? What's your take on it all?
Well, I think Joe's precisely correct, and I think that it is not a transitory trend that we're seeing with inflation. And I think ordinary Canadians will look at their utility bills as an example and see how those have gone up. And I think that this is probably a segue into the whole discussion about COP26 and the importance of energy as it relates to being able to fuel and run your economy. So energy is a big part of this inflationary mix, and I think that the trend lines are going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, no, I think that you're quite correct there, and it'll be interesting to see, as Joe mentioned. We've got about 30 seconds, Joe. Maybe are you predicting higher interest rates, Joe?
Well, eventually they're going to start moving, and of course, what the bank can control are short-term rates, but longer-term rates are in the hands of the market. But just to emphasize Gary's point, in Europe right now, we have an energy crisis, and we also have energy poverty.
That's a good segue, because right after the break, we're going to get right into it with COP26. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust for the monthly panel. We've got two of our regular panelists with us today. The Honorable Joe Oliver, of course, former Minister of Natural Resources and Finance in the Harper government, and Gary Marr, who is now head of the Canada West Foundation. I didn't mention that in the introduction, but that is indeed where he is today. Gary, I'm going to start with you, though. Obviously, COP26 is ongoing. Just give us your general thoughts on what's happened so far and what it means for Canada.
Well, let me start by saying I attended COP5 in Berlin back in 1999. And I think that as I've observed what's happened with the Conference of the Parties over the last quarter of a century is that, first of all, it's a consensus model of decision-making, which means that the pace is set by the least willing partners that are part of the agreement. The result has been over 25 years that there's been protocols, there's been mandates, there's been platforms, there's been agreements, there's been complete collapses of agreements, there's been action plans, which has amounted essentially to not much of anything, except this, in my opinion. The discussions that have been had and will continue to have through COP26 has resulted in a real change in investment into traditional hydrocarbons. And the pace at which the divestment has gone in this area has outstripped the pace of the increase in their replacements. And that, I think, has resulted in what Joe referred to as energy poverty going on in Europe. You see gas prices that are now 5x, 6x of what they were. You see the price, Henry Hub price for natural gas is, sort of up around $6, and it's not even cold yet. It could be $10 or $12 by the time December and January roll around. You see the price of gasoline going up, and you're seeing people like the President of the United States saying, gee, we want more production of oil from Saudi Arabia and OPEC nations because we want affordable gas prices. So the pace at which we have divested from the production of hydrocarbons has resulted in a paucity of it. The supply is not meeting the demand, and that's what's causing prices to go up and creating this energy crisis that we see in Europe, and maybe coming soon to a neighborhood near you in North America.
Yeah, that's the worry, isn't it? Joe Oliver, I think you can either comment on what Gary just said, which is really meaningful, or you can tell us your own thoughts about COP26 so far. Take it away.
Well, let me just follow up on what Gary said, which I totally agree with. Europe has moved off baseload fuels to renewables, and they're not always there. They're not always reliable. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow, as they found out in Europe. And as a result, they're scrambling to get coal production up. They're begging Putin for gas. The President of the United States is begging OPEC for more production, having turned down Keystone XL. And meantime, there are threats, real threats of blackouts in Germany and the UK, and as I mentioned earlier, energy poverty. There's also an impact, of course, on competitiveness because the cost of fuel is part of the cost of doing business. And if the costs go up, other countries that don't have those same cost pressures are going to be advantaged. So this is a real problem. To bring it to Canada, as we know, Canada represents 1.6% of global emissions. So by itself cannot impact on in any measurable way on the temperature, the global temperature. So the argument one has left is that we have a moral responsibility to do our part. But the question is, are others doing their part, and are we doing the most effective thing at the least cost? And I think it's actually the opposite. We're doing the least effective thing at the highest cost. We've got three countries, China, India, and Russia, who are increasing GHG emissions, and they're going to until 2050 or beyond. They represent 40% of global emissions. And so there's no chance whatsoever of keeping the temperature to 1.5 degrees according to any temperature model.
I think I'm going to just cut you off there because we are bumping into another break, but hold on to that thought. We'll come right back to it after the break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the monthly panel. We've got Joe Oliver here, a former finance minister, and Gary Marr, former minister and now head of the Canada West Foundation. Joe, please finish your point, an important one, and we'll get to the next question.
Yes, I wanted to talk about the cost of getting to where the government has committed us to reduce emissions from, I think it's 2005, by 40 to 45% by 2030, according to the Institute of Sustainable Development, Sustainable Finance, I guess, is which is associated with the University, the Queen's University, would cost $200 billion in the next 9 years. And RBC Economics said that to get to net zero by 2050 would cost the Canadian economy $2 trillion. So, I mean, these are massive amounts, and are we going about it the right way? I mean, we could reduce net global emissions by producing more gas and oil and selling it to Asia to reduce their consumption of coal. And coal has 2 times the amount of GHG emissions than natural gas does. So we're not, we're confronting an immense cost. And I don't think people realize how it's going to impact on them, because when you talk billions, it doesn't have meaning. No. It's when it affects their personal pockets, which it will, and there's a potential for sort of a financial crisis. And are we doing the sorts of things which could actually enhance our contribution while allowing our economy to grow? And perversely, we're doing the opposite in both areas.
Yeah, let's get to Gary Marr point of view. Gary, obviously Justin Trudeau, while at COP26, announced basically a cap on emissions for the oil and gas sector for Canada. Give us your take on what Mr. Trudeau's position is and what it means.
Well, I think that it has caused some alarm in the oil and gas industry. I agree with Joe when he says that we're going to be continuing to use fossil fuels for many, many decades to come. And that we should give credit to the oil and gas industry for the types of efforts that they're making to decarbonize industrial process and being able to recover energy while at the same time, containing and sequestering the CO2. I think this is a step in the right direction. But I want to talk a bit about how the Prime Minister seems to think that, for example, converting vehicles to electric vehicles by 2035 creates its own sort of pathway of environmental concerns. To do that, you need batteries. To make batteries, you need minerals. You need minerals like cobalt, nickel, lithium, vanadium, and so on. So the great news is we have those minerals here in Canada. The question is then, well, how long does it take to permit a mine in this country? If you ask some people from the mining sector, they might say, well, it might be 10 years before you get through your environmental reviews. And at the end of it, you might get a no. But let's assume that we started a mine permit today. We got to 2031 and we actually got a mine permitted. Would it have the minerals ready for the electrification of our automobile sector by 2035? The answer is no. So where would you get your minerals from? You'd end up getting them from China or perhaps a strip mine somewhere in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all of which, has environmental impact. And so in my view, should we be developing resources here in Canada where we have some control over the environmental standards that are applied to developing those resources? Or should we move our supply chain of such minerals to places where we have little or no control over the environmental standards in their development?
You know,
See,
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the problems with COP and the environmental alarmism is that it's always the last best chance. Every year, this is the last year, and if we wait one more second, we're doomed. It's a climate catastrophe, but we just maybe have a chance that we act instantly. Well, they keep repeating that, so I mean, it's like the guy who cried wolf. I mean, who can believe that this is the last best chance when next year they're going to say the very same thing? But the other problem, which Gary just alluded to, is if you're forcing people to move quickly, first of all, it becomes economically devastating, and secondly, you don't do the longer term planning that you need to do to maybe most effective in achieving the results that you want to achieve. If 20 years ago said, look, we have a problem. It's 20, 30, 40 years out, but it's serious, and let's get on with it. And let's do some shorter, intermediate, and longer term planning.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, as always, Tony Clement, here with 2/3 of the panel anyway. We've got Gary Marr, who's a former Alberta Cabinet Minister, now head of the Canada West Foundation, and of course, the Honourable Joe Oliver, former Natural Resources as well as Finance Minister under the Harper government. Gary, obviously another person making waves, not just Justin Trudeau, but his new Environment Minister, Minister Guilbeault, a little bit making some waves in Alberta too, with some of his wording on where he's going to land on how to get from A to B. Maybe your comments on that?
Well, his issues with respect to emissions, but I would say that the oil and gas industry has also been fixated on the issue of getting down its emissions as well. Mm-hmm. But note that less than 20% of the total emissions that come from the development of the oil sands comes from the production phase, and that number is getting better and better and better all the time. There may come a day where instead of using natural gas to heat the bitumen, perhaps we could use nuclear power to do it, and we would end up with some of the greenest oil in the world. The issue then is the 80% of the emissions that actually come out of the tailpipe of your automobile.
Right.
So to me, Minister Guilbeault's focus on the oil and gas companies is really taking the consumer off the hook. I think he believes that big oil is making a lot of money, but it's actually the consumer that is producing the emissions. Most of the emissions come from the combustion phase of fossil fuels, i.e., in your automobile. So I think some combination of being able to recognize that we need to be able to we should not be shirking our responsibilities of dealing with the lowering of emissions, which is the ambition of the oil and gas industry. But we should also say that it's not just the oil and gas industry that is mostly responsible for it. The transportation sector is probably the biggest area where we could make some changes. And right now, rolling up and down the highways between Calgary and Edmonton, there are large fleets of trucks that are running on hydrogen. Not far from my office, CP Rail Yard is building a 3,500 horsepower locomotive for pulling trains. So, developing hydrogen for certain aspects of the transportation sector where you can sequester the carbon in the ground, I think is a very, very good solution to helping reduce our GHG emissions, while at the same time developing future-fit hydrocarbons. It's good for the energy sector. It's also good for the environment.
I think we're going to be talking about this next month too. But Joe Oliver, we got about a minute left. Is Mr. Guilbeault and Mr. Trudeau, are they going to be tearing Confederation apart with some of their stances, or what's going to happen?
Well, there's definitely going to be an impact on national unity. Alberta and Saskatchewan have really been hurt very badly, and it's to a large extent because of deliberate policy action, which is designed to hurt, Alberta's critical industry. But it's not only critical to Alberta; it's 10% of our GDP. There's some direct and indirect 800,000 jobs in play. It's a contributor to equalization and so on. So, we've got to be extremely careful about destroying an industry which this government and Stephen Guilbeault, who is, viewed by many people as a radical, who climbs up the CN Tower to deride the natural resources. He's in the catbird seat, and the former Minister of the Environment, Jonathan Wilkinson, is now the Minister of Natural Resources. Can you imagine if I had moved from natural resources to the environment? What that have meant? Of course, you can't imagine it because it's unthinkable.
Maybe it's in the alternative universe. That's all our time for today, but I want to thank these two gentlemen, Gary Marr and Joe Oliver, for always being here. Hopefully, Sandra Patello will be back with us next month as well. Thanks again, and we'll join you again next month. Very interesting discussion with Gary Marr and Joe Oliver, as usual. We'll be following COP26 over the next few weeks as well. Thanks for watching.